We're joined now by Brian Reisinger. He's a public affairs consultant, but most importantly, for the purposes of this interview, he's the author of a really beautiful new book. It's called Land Rich, Cash Poor: My Family's Hope and the Untold Story of the Disappearing American Farmer. Brian, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me on, Emily. I appreciate it.
Of course. We were talking a little bit before we started recording just about how beautiful I found the book. Now, a lot of our viewers might know I'm from Wisconsin. Brian's also from Wisconsin. So a lot of the descriptions, just of the land physically, I found so stirring. And Brian, before I ask you a question, I want to read an excerpt from your introduction because I think it sets the table for the conversation really well. You write, "For decades, America's food system increased production to provide as much food as possible, as affordably as possible, a fact that some consider a modern wonder of the world, while others fear it has degraded our nutrition and environment. In any case, that system succeeded in the goal of affordable food up to a point, but faltering supply chains and skyrocketing food costs in the wake of the COVID-19 global pandemic have shown its limits. The disappearance of family farms has fueled this problem through the loss of economic diversity." Now, your family's farm in Wisconsin has not quite disappeared. Tell us why, Brian.
Yeah, we're in that fight to keep from disappearing, which is part of what I hope made the book compelling and part of what made me want to write about it. So our farm was a dairy farm for 4 generations. Started with my great-grandpa when he escaped pre-World War I Europe, all the way up through my dad and my sister, who works with my dad on the farm and is working to take it over. And in spring of 2021, we sold our dairy herd. We were what would have once been a medium-sized farm, and we were kind of getting to be a smaller farm. Sold that dairy herd and transitioned in what we call diversified farming. And there's a lot of different trends in farming, a lot of people trying a lot of different things. What that means for us is we raise heifers for other dairy herds, so cattle that are going to become milk cows on other farms. We raise beef for consumers, and we raise a wide range of cash crops as opposed to mainly just raising corn and alfalfa to feed our cows. So we're still in the dairy industry, we're in the beef industry, we're in the cash crop industry, we're doing a lot of different things trying to figure out the right path forward. But it was a really big change when we went from being a regular dairy farm to being a diversified small Wisconsin farm.
Well, and so just talk to me about personally why, you're a very successful public affairs consultant. That's actually how we know each other, Brian. You're on the right, and you've done some work for really high profile people, but you split your time between your kind of day job, but maybe that's even too much to call it that because you're doing a ton of farming as well. Why personally was that so important to you? I mean, you have this big career, but you're also spending time on a dairy farm shoveling what I can only imagine. I don't even want to go there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Growing up, I always had a sense that our way of life was disappearing. My dad was sort of a rare man and becoming more rare because there were just fewer and fewer people like him. I always had that sense, teachers would talk about how many kids grew up on farms and raise your hand, and it was a dwindling number every year. So I always had that sense, but I never really knew why that was. And then when I got out into the working world, I had a little bit less talent for crops and cattle than my sister and dad, and so I pursued a career off the farm. And to your point, I was in business journalism for about a decade. Then I was in public policy, worked on Capitol Hill and on campaigns, and now I'm at a consulting firm where we work on bipartisan, nonpartisan, private sector, a whole wide range of issue advocacy. And the reason that I came back around to the farm issue and sort of married my writing career and a career in public policy and public issues with farming is because I felt like maybe now I can answer that question after having ventured out from the farm, what actually happened. And so I took years of interviews that I'd been doing with family all the way back to my grandpa's generation who grew up in the poverty of the Great Depression and climbed in the middle class despite the horror of that time, and did interviews with family and others in our local community, try to piece together, okay, what was going on the ground? What is the hidden story that a lot of the country wouldn't know that our farms work through and fight through to survive generation to generation? And I married that with what I'd been seeing and learning about the economy as a business journalist in public policy and then as a consultant. And what I found is that there really were hidden eras of history. Each era, each decade, parts of the economy were visible to people, but not all of it was. And by marrying my family's story with what went on, I was able to see how economic upheaval, social change, technological change that was both good and bad, policy, and all kinds of other trends piled on and compounded upon one another to create this phenomena where we are losing, on average, for the past century, 45,000 farms per year. And that is something that has been relentless, and it has happened under Democrats and Republicans. It has happened in good economic times and bad economic times. And it's really quite a mystery for why that would be. And so by marrying my family story with these issues going on in the public sphere, I think I was able to crack that code a little bit, or at least that's what we wanted to do.
You know, a lot of people would just say, of course, this is consolidation, and you write extensively about consolidation. But I also want to preface this next question with that theme, because it comes up a lot in the book. You write about the vanishing rural workforce of the 1940s. And I do think, to your point about stories that people don't know, that's one that, you know it when you hear it. You're like, oh, yeah, of course, all of these different trends happened in the post-war period, during the war itself. But you don't necessarily put the dots together unless you're thinking about it like you did, Brian. So talk to us about that decade. Talk to us about the vanishing rural workforce. What part of the story are we missing in that sense?
It's a great example of how there's a certain amount of history that people are aware of. There might be a broad economic trend that we know is happening, but people don't know, and I didn't know until I investigated what was going on beneath the surface of that trend. So in the 1940s, what was happening, a lot of people know that at that time, we of course had men and women being shipped off to war for World War II. It was leaving places in the industrial economy. And there were more and more women who came to the workforce at that time. The other thing that was going on is a lot of people from rural areas came to urban areas, et cetera. People knew that. But what people didn't know is the devastating rural depopulation that began in the 1940s. And at that time, we still had a majority of our country that was rural. It was around 57%. And it began to change and took a hard fall. And some of this was natural. And that's what's so hard about some of these trends. Some of it's natural, and some of it is more insidious and more troubling. The natural thing is for a certain amount of kids who grew up on the farm to shift toward the urban economy. There was opportunity. There was the bright lights of the city. A lot of these kids had grown up in poverty. Also, there were families of like 14, and there'd be like one farm, or like maybe one farm, and then like dad can help like the eldest son, purchase and get their start on a new farm. And then both farms are going to be working to pay off the debt for decades. But you can't do that 14 times for all those kids, which was the case with my grandpa's family. And so there was a natural amount of sons and daughters of rural areas that were going to go to urban areas. That was normal. That was natural. But what happened at this time is it was such a massive shift. And it came at a time when our rural economy was shifting to urban in such a stark way that rural economic opportunity was not going to last forever, and it was going to begin to flag. And the loss of the workforce to such a great degree made it harder, and it became this self-reinforcing cycle. So where it was natural for some folks to go to the city, it happened to such a great degree that as our farms were disappearing, we were also lacking the people we needed to carry on the farms, and that made more farms disappear, which made the rural economy weaker. And so it was this self-reinforcing kind of downward spiral that began in the 1940s.
So is that where some of these corporate behemoths then step into the vacuum and start hoovering up family farms? Talk to us about the patterns of consolidation. A lot of people are familiar with recent trends, but how did we get here? That's one of the questions that you ask in the book. It's just simply, how did we let this happen? That's a quote. And it was really sort of poignant to me when I read that. Where does consolidation come into the picture?
Absolutely. As you said, consolidation is something I talk about, and I try to talk about it in nuance. I want to answer your question first, and then I'll circle back to the way to treat consolidation, because people who believe in markets know some of it's natural, and I want to come back to that. But what happened here was not natural. To answer your question more specifically, when we got out of the 1940s into the 1950s, the thing that came right on the tail of this rural workforce depopulation phenomena that we saw is that the American economy made a major shift toward farms being the little guy in a much bigger economy. We went into the 1950s, the 1960s. There were huge economic expansions, times of prosperity, which was great for America, and it was good for many farmers. But the other thing that happened is the farmer became the little guy alongside of big government and big business. We had all kinds of expansion going on in the economy, and more of our industries began to be dominated by larger players. So it wasn't just farms getting bigger or buyers from and suppliers to farms getting bigger, but all across our American economy. Think McDonald's, think General Electric, think every kind of company. We began to move in a direction where our economy began to be dominated by bigger and bigger companies, and the farmer was more and more of the little guy. So that's kind of what happened after the 1940s.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. You also write about ecological decay, and that's something I think a lot of people, on the right will often miss, although you would probably contend, because you've been in these spaces long enough, that, farmers who maybe vote Republican now, even though they voted Democrat for generations, have always been worried about ecological decay. They've always been worried about degradation of the environment because they see it firsthand. And you write, it has accompanied this decline in family farm, but it's not merely the source of an environmental debate, also an existential issue for everyone to solve. Entire societies have risen and fallen based on the availability of water and how they've treated the soil that sustains them. It just feels like I feel so condemned reading that as a society, but it's powerful and important. Maybe you could just catch some people up on what's actually happened here.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an area, one of many areas in the book, where I found that the right and the left have a stake in trying to figure out what to do. And there are ways in which policymakers on the right and policymakers on the left have contributed toward this over the decades. Nobody's hands are clean. And farm policy and food policy will defy anyone's ideology. But the reality is that that also means that there are ways that we can all come together to solve solutions. So right now, it is very common to hear about farm interest groups and environmental interest groups kind of at each other's throats, battling over things like the Green New Deal, what have you, things like environmental regulation, all that sort of stuff. The reality is that beneath that, there is a truth here, which is that farmers are the original conservationists. And there are a lot of things that they would say about how to preserve and sustain their land and continue to make it something they can make a living on and they can continue to value living as close to it as they do. There's a lot of overlap between that and what you hear from conservationists and environmentalists about their concerns. So part of what we talk about in the book is places where our country has made the wrong choices because we kind of were faced with a false choice and we began to go down sort of this path we didn't need to. So how do we break out of those false choices? A perfect example is soil quality. Farmers have an interest in having soil quality high enough that it can continue to yield more and more crops. And that's something that is becoming harder and harder. Productivity in general of our farms has been, worldwide leader, but is slowing for a variety of reasons. Some of them are environmental. Some of them have to do with all kinds of other economic issues. They have to do with research and development and a lack of innovation in our private sector economy beyond the farm gate, all kinds of things. But there is a desire and a value in having the soil able to yield as much as possible for farms. Those are also the things that make sure that our soil has the nutrients that they need, that environmentalists care about from a soil quality and environmental quality standpoint. Same is true of water. They say that water's for fighting over, whiskey's for drinking, right? The reality is that our water, having an abundant supply where the aquifers underneath our country's surface are able to supply farmers with what they need. Farmers have an intense interest to have enough water. That's something that environmentalists are worried about too. So part of what we see in the hidden history of the Disappearing American Farmer is actually an opportunity to set aside some of these debates that are sort of over the areas where we don't agree and look in places where the right and left can say, wait a minute, we have a mutual shared interest here. Let's solve this. And then we can figure out what more we need to do on some of these other issues.
So the most a lot of people thought about this issue in particular is probably surrounding the baby formula crisis that struck the U.S. And actually, you have a background in dairy farming. Kind of as we have that in the rearview mirror a little bit, we see that there's protectionism involved. And we see that there are these massive conversations about, for example, the Farm Bill, for example, corporate welfare or, tariffs. All of these major conversations, huge in states like Wisconsin and Iowa. Where do those, corporate welfare and tariffs, what role do they play in all of this? I know you're being really helpful in explaining that there are issues where the right and left can agree. We've seen that between, Trump and Bernie Sanders, but even between, Republicans and Democrats that are sort of mainstream centrists, not anti-establishment figures in big states, big agricultural states. So what role has all of this played?
Yeah, almost everybody has something about our general farm policy system that they don't like. And that includes the farmers that are living it. That includes the people on the outside of it who are debating it from the right to left and everywhere in between. And so there's a lot to unpack there. What I would say about subsidies first and the issue of corporate welfare first is we have a system right now that has basically one program has been piled on top of another because our parties have never really taken a look. I mean, there have been changes, but like deep reforms, there's never really been like a debate around like, where do we have new areas of agreement? How do we reorient this policy? And so you've just had programs piled on top of one another, which, people from the right who are concerned about the growth of government, rightly are concerned about that. People from the left who are concerned about subsidies going to some and not others and sort of some favoritism that can occur there. It's all prone to abuse and favoritism. And so it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any subsidy. There is a certain amount of safety net needed for things like uncontrollable weather if we want to have a stable food supply. But it doesn't mean that we should be utilizing government to sort of steer and guarantee outcomes. Right now, you have a lot of farms that, because it's been getting harder and harder to find new entrepreneurial opportunity, they go after the subsidy rich areas just because that's a place where they know they can get some income, not because that's necessarily what they want to do. And so you have this situation where people can really rightly criticize it from all kinds of different directions. And even the people who are needing to operate within it would criticize it as well. So there's an opportunity to really open this up and try to make the whole situation much more entrepreneurial in a way that the right can appreciate, in a way that the left can appreciate on that front. And I think it's really important that we try to figure that out. Now, the issue of tariffs, we have a problem where in the 90s, the trade deals that our parties made, Republicans and Democrats, they created opportunity, but they also didn't necessarily have a way to guard against some of the things that can happen where, you open up a foreign market and that foreign country comes into your market as well. That's what happens. It's a mutual trade deal. And they might have lower costs, lower standards. A lot of times you heard about lower labor standards from the left. You didn't necessarily see that argument win out, and you didn't hear it on the right. But the reality is that what happened is that for farmers, their markets here internally and domestically were flooded with goods that were cheaper, not because they were running better farms in other countries, but because they didn't adhere to the same, environmental or labor standards, have the same costs. So there's a legitimate debate that's going on here. What's happened in this country is we've really kind of shut down free trade as a result. Both the Republicans and the Democrats, more recently under Biden, have decided that we're going to kind of just hold off on this whole free trade thing. And what I discovered when I was examining this issue that extended through the 90s and 2000s on up to today is that's also a false choice. We can have free trade that opens new markets, and we can have protections against those countries that cheat. And one of the ways to do it is, rather than trying to have these massive trade deals, the big, kind of the omnibus behemoth trade deal that, to end all trade deals kind of thing, it's really hard to design those in a way that also has the appropriate protections. And I'm not necessarily talking about tariffs. I'm not necessarily talking about protectionism there. I'm talking about, for instance, cut a deal with a specific country where we have a product they need and they have a product we need, and knock down the trade barriers around that. And one of the reasons that a lot of experts on both the right and the left acknowledge that this would make more sense is because it allows us to go after a good where American farmers could have an entrepreneurial opportunity in another country. It allows us to bring goods in from another country where we might actually need that supply. And it's easier to enforce, because if you're dealing with one individual country and they are cheating, you have more leverage. We're America, and you're dealing with that one individual country. I'm not saying we never have a trade deal that involves multiple countries again. I'm not saying we only have trade deals that only deal with one or two goods. You can probably do larger than that. But the point is, if you focus on small scale, you can target entrepreneurial opportunities for our farmers. You can target goods that our consumers need that maybe isn't going to flood the markets of our farmers here domestically. And it's more enforceable. So something more nimble is something that would maybe allow us to open more markets and guard against some of the cheating that made so many people frustrated with free trade that our country really shut that down.
What has all of this done to our health? That's a huge question. It's something you write about. The Farm Bill is a really good example. We were just talking about it. You have, Coca-Cola lobbying for, soda to be available on SNAP and all of that. But what's the kind of big picture of how the degradation of family farms has, degraded American health?
There are more worries than ever about what's for dinner. And that relates to the cost and the availability of food, which are their own separate issues, but it also relates to the health of our food. And the reality is that somewhere north of 70% of people in one form or another are concerned about the additives that are in our food as we get increasingly processed food. The reality also is that more and more people have fewer options in terms of where to get their food. So rather than having people able to buy in local and regional markets, as well as being able to buy off of the national supply chain that comes into our regular grocery stores, there just aren't as many options. And I think you find not only consumers locally, but also grocery stores and other types of people in the food industry who would love to offer more fresh local options in different ways. And they aren't able to do that because of the way that our supply chain works. We have very few distribution channels, and we have food coming from places where it needs to be freeze dried and frozen and preserved and pumped with all kinds of things so that when it gets to your doorstep, it still resembles what it's supposed to look like. But it doesn't necessarily taste as good as if it was grown locally. It's not as healthy as if it was grown locally. And it also doesn't represent the consumer choice that could really change a lot of this stuff.
When we look at things like the revolt of the Dutch farmers and, areas in Europe that have been rocked by, to borrow the word again, revolting farmers, do you see a glimpse of America's future? Is that a preview of what's to come? Or are we different in significant fundamental ways to the point where it's not really apples and oranges?
I sure hope not. And I think that what you see there and what you see over and over in different places is that no country has really gotten this right. The issue of how do you sustain farmers in an entrepreneurial way that can allow for opportunity for them and that can allow for the kind of food supply that our country needs is not something that any country has really gotten right. New Zealand went the direction of really working to get rid of as many programs as possible. Canada has gone the direction of supply management, where they have a really severe protectionism that allows their price to be stable, but doesn't really allow their farmers to be able to do a whole lot in terms of being able to expand and pursue new opportunities. So nobody's really gotten this right. Something that gives me hope here in America is that we still have nearly 2 million farms. So even though we've lost more than 4 million at the clip of 45,000 annually per year for the past century on average, the reality is that nearly 2 million farms remain, and 96% of them are family farms. So we have something really cool and, unique to a degree in America, which is we still have a lot of small landowners. Now, most of the food is being produced by the largest farms and going through our large, sophisticated global supply chain. But most of the farms are still medium and small. And all of our farms, regardless of small, medium, or large, are 96% of them are those family operations. So that means that we have nearly 2 million resilient farm families that have maybe been making it by getting a little bit bigger, that have been maybe making it by finding some sort of unique niche, or most of them have making it probably by having 2 to 3 jobs, pouring concrete, working construction jobs, pulling a factory shift, in addition to operating a farm that's a supplemental income. What if we were to change things and reorient things so that all of those 2 million families could have new entrepreneurial opportunity? This would allow for our food supply issues to be revolutionized and fixed, and it would allow us to at least stop or change or slow the disappearance of family farms. And that gets back to the natural thing about consolidation. There was always going to be some consolidation. As soon as America was settled, there was going to be some. Some of that is natural. What happened in this country isn't natural consolidation. It is government policy, it is economic upheaval, and it is us failing to see social and technological trends that have stamped out our farms year after year in a way that doesn't need to occur in this market.
So, Brian, my last question is hopefully an easy one. This is such a timely conversation around Labor Day. We're moving into the harvest season and talking about one of the most essential forms of labor, one of the most difficult forms of labor, but as you know, one of the most rewarding forms of labor. You write in the book, we are losing not only the family farms that feed us, but also a part of ourselves. What do you mean by that, Brian?
Yeah, it's not only an economic crisis, but a cultural crisis. It's true that our food prices are going through the roof much faster than the inflation that everyone's debating. And it's true that we have a vulnerable supply chain where during COVID and during bird flu and during different issues that crop up, we don't have the food supply that we need, and that's only going to get worse. But more fundamental to that is I can say that growing up on the land, seeing my dad work the land, it gets down in your blood and your bones. And it's done that with America. Even though most of our residents don't live on farms anymore, it's part of our identity. This is central to who we think of ourselves as Americans. The ownership of land, the small land ownership, the natural resources, the ability to go out there and dig your living out of the dirt, and the individualism that comes with that, but then also the sense of community that comes with come running when your neighbor's in trouble. These are values that are deeply ingrained in America. And as we lose our farms, our food's becoming more expensive and less reliable, and also we're losing part of our own selves, part of our own identity in terms of the way that we look at ourselves. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the rural-urban divide has become a wide chasm. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're not able to work out environmental issues, even though there's areas for compromise. It's not a coincidence that we have a rural drug crisis, just like our urban drug crisis. And it's not a coincidence that any of these problems are getting worse and worse and worse. It all ties back to the fact that we're losing the farms that feed us, and we're losing the farms that sort of inform to a degree who we are as a people. It's not the only source of our national identity, but it's a central part of it. And when you see something decaying like that and nothing is being done, you begin to sort of shrug your shoulders and turn away from it, and you don't realize the decay that's going on in other areas as well as a result of that.
Nothing quite like your neighbors giving you their surplus corn or tomatoes, or in your case, Brian, some of the milk and probably eggs. Thank you, Brian Reisinger. The book is called Land Rich, Cash Poor. Go out and buy it. It's so good. Brian, I just appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Emily. People can get the book, Land Rich Cash Poor, at their local bookstore. If they call or ask for it, it's either in stock or they can get it for you, or you can get it on Amazon, online, anywhere you buy your books online. I hope people check it out, and I appreciate people spreading the word. I think it's an issue that we can solve if we all work together.